So just to go over the agenda here before we dive in, we will begin why it's important for SMEs to report in line with these internationally recognized frameworks, breaking down what establishes a successful and ambitious climate strategy. Then we're going to discuss the carbon accounting process and touch on the most influential standards for disclosure and how straightforward the process can be for SMEs to set and attain targets aligned with science. And then we're going to finish up by discussing the importance of climate risk in today's business environment and why emission reductions matter before bringing it all together with some information on the CDP. And then lastly, we're just going to conclude with some key takeaways for getting started, and we'll be taking any questions that you may have at the end of the session in a Q&A. So let's begin by highlighting the importance of reporting for SMEs. So despite their small size, SMEs are vital to the fight against climate change. According to the World Bank, small and medium-sized enterprises make up about 90% of the businesses and account for more than 50% of employment worldwide. A large portion of those are also classified as micro SMEs, meaning that they have 10 or fewer employees. So to have any possibility of having global emissions by 2030, SMEs need to join the race to net zero. And given the vast amount of SMEs globally, your company's involvement in emission reduction strategy will play a huge role in the fight against climate change. SMEs are also especially vulnerable to the wide-reaching impacts of climate change due to their small operational size, limited resources, and risk management processes. This just emphasizes the importance of bolstering your climate resiliency in light of climate uncertainty and novel regulations. So as a small or medium enterprise, aside from the clear benefits of working towards a cleaner and safer planet, SMEs can gain various competitive advantage from choosing to report. There are various benefits that disclosure can provide your business, and this list here that we've compiled are just some of the main ones. It's not all inclusive, but these are important. So the first benefit is to improve and protect your reputation. So as customer and stakeholder demands evolve, sustainability will play a key role in distinguishing your company from your competitors by building trust through transparency and responding to rising environmental concern among the public. Consumers and stakeholders are becoming more and more aware of the impacts of climate change than ever before. And being proactive in your reporting routines will ensure that your business is viewed in a favorable light by stakeholders and potential investors. By choosing to disclose, you can also boost your competitive advantage. So disclosing your company's ESG information will provide you with a competitive edge when it comes to performance on the stock market, access to capital, and winning tenders. You will also be able to track and benchmark your progress. So tracking and reporting emissions can greatly benefit your small or medium-sized enterprise in the short, medium, and long term. Benchmarking your environmental performance against your industry peers will ensure that your company is competitive in your industry, and it allows you to closely monitor the progress you're making towards your goals and targets. You will also be able to uncover risks and opportunities. So by identifying emerging environmental risks and opportunities that would otherwise be overlooked, you can increase your awareness of your climate impacts and take advantage of any newly discovered opportunities that you may have missed otherwise. You will also be able to get ahead of regulations. So additionally, new regulations are in the pipeline that will require a higher level of due diligence for SMEs when it comes to climate reporting. Currently, the SEC is developing a new set of regulations regarding climate disclosure that will impact the SMEs to a reasonable degree. And that's slated for release later this year. Virginia is going to go into more detail regarding the new regulation later in our presentation. Mandatory disclosure is gaining more momentum, and it's only a matter of time until SMEs will be required by law to disclose certain climate-related information. So by staying ahead of these new requirements, your company will avoid the growing pains of adapting to a new paradigm of climate disclosure. And then finally, you can increase your resiliency. So by taking part in a comprehensive reporting process in alignment with the internationally recognized frameworks that we at CEMAsys follow, you will gain a better understanding of your business's strengths and weaknesses, allowing you to better understand how climate change will inevitably impact your business and how to be better prepared for when it does. So now I'm going to hand things off to my colleague, Virginia, who will present you with a roadmap to creating a robust and comprehensive climate strategy.
Thank you so much, Zach, for that introduction. And I'll just dive right into why it's so important for you all to have a robust climate strategy. So climate change is transforming the business environment in which companies operate. As we see climate change progress, we're also seeing increase in extreme weather events, increased severity and frequency, such as hurricanes, flooding, drought, etc. And businesses are working more now than ever to protect their assets and their value chains. So it's important that you have a strategy to prepare for these climate impacts, but to also be a part of the solution. As frameworks and regulations are developing, so should your strategy. So with these frameworks that we're going to dive into throughout this presentation, they're being updated with better methodologies. We're seeing stricter regulations come down the line. So it's really important that you establish a strong climate foundation early on so that you can prepare for these upcoming changes. And it lends itself back to the idea that Zach just talked about resiliency in the future. And then lastly, your strategy needs to help solve the challenge. And the challenge is that we must stabilize global temperature rise to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And ideally, we need to reduce global emissions by at least 50% by 2050. So it's incredibly important that your strategy is not only part of the solution, but also prepares your company for those coming impacts. So this is why you need a climate strategy, but how do you start and what exactly does a climate strategy look like? So here is a roadmap towards a robust climate strategy. It sets out a streamlined pathway that is efficient in order for you all to achieve your sustainability goals. I'm going to touch on these now, but we're going to be going in more depth on these points throughout this presentation. So the first step is to develop a carbon inventory. So getting an understanding of where your emissions lie and how much your company is emitting is the first step. The second step would be to assess your carbon reduction potentials. Where can you reduce and by how much? The third is to develop a low carbon transition plan and set those science-based targets to reduce your emissions. The next step, number 4, is to identify and manage climate-related risks and opportunities. Number 5, harmonize your climate strategy with your business strategy and operations, so incorporating them into your culture and into your governance. And then lastly, monitoring and updating your progress. So at the core of robust climate strategy are these global frameworks that are used to report and track on climate impacts and the impacts that the climate has on your company. And by aligning yourselves and using these frameworks, you're setting yourselves up for the future to follow the best practices recognized worldwide. I'm going to be going into more detail on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Joe later on is going to tell you more information about the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. But really quick, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol simply establishes a universal and global framework on how we report on our emissions. The Science-Based Targets Initiative is used to set and track progress against your climate targets. And the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures allows you to pinpoint specific risks and opportunities that your company may face and how you can implement a climate response into your everyday risks and operations. So Zach mentioned the upcoming regulations earlier, and I just want to touch on this briefly before we move on the climate strategy. So the SEC has proposed new climate disclosure rules, and they seek a more in-depth and consistent information on climate-related risks and their effect on business operations for public companies. So the purpose of this rule is to enhance the transparency between listed companies and allow for investors to make more informed decisions, as we're seeing that it's becoming a much more salient issue for them. And some of the disclosure requirements would include disclosing on the material impacts that climate will have on your company and how these risks will impact strategy, business model, and your outlook. It is also a requirement to report on your Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions. However, there are exemptions for smaller reporting companies for Scope 3. So the proposed rule would provide a safe harbor for liability from Scope 3 emission disclosures and an exemption from the Scope 3 emission disclosure requirement for these smaller companies. So we've talked a little bit about why you need a climate strategy. We've emphasized the importance of the frameworks at the core of your climate strategy. But now I want to go through the first step of developing a robust climate strategy, which is your carbon accounting. So your carbon accounting is a way of measuring how much greenhouse gas emissions your organization emits and quantifies its impacts on the climate. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the global standardized framework to measure and manage these greenhouse gas emissions. And it's important to compile a comprehensive inventory, as it'll improve your understanding of your emission profile or any potential liabilities or exposures. It can also help you boost your energy efficiency, identify the hot spots, and potentially development of new products that may help reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And here at CEMAsys, we like to say, what you can measure, you can manage. So getting an understanding of your carbon accounting will get you going in the right step. So a little bit more about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and how we use it. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, like I said before, is recognized as best practice when reporting on your carbon footprint. So it divides your emissions into 3 different scopes. Scope 1 being the direct emissions from your owned or controlled entities. This is the combustion from your company cars or refrigerants or any emissions that come from the production of any products you may make. Scope 2 are the indirect emissions from energy at an offsite location. So this is your electricity, this is your heating, cooling and steam, etc. And then scope 3 are all of the indirect emissions from your value chain. So there are actually 15 categories of emissions in scope 3, and they're separated into the upstream and the downstream. If you want to report on your emissions in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, it is required to disclose and report on scope 1 and 2, but scope 3 is voluntary. So I know for SMEs, smaller companies, you may not have as many resources. The scope 3, figuring out which categories are relevant to you can take some time. So it's totally acceptable to start with your scope 1 and scope 2, focus on those, figure out where you get the data, get into a reporting routine with those 2 scopes, and then start working and focusing on your scope 3. So where do you start with your carbon accounting process? Well, the first thing that we recommend is to choose a specialized management system. So while this is not a requirement by any means, it's something that we recommend because these data sets can get pretty large, and it's really important that you have an efficient way to store your emissions data so that you can compare year on year, compare between scopes, etc. So the second step would be to map and measure your emissions in scope 1 and scope 2. And so many companies, when they begin doing this, they will choose a baseline year. Oftentimes it's they choose to be 2019 because it's reflective of regular business operations prior to COVID. And then just figuring out where do you get the data. So for scope 1 and scope 2, this may look like looking at your old electricity bills or understanding the consumption from the gas of your company cars. That's what that looks like. So then once you've mapped and measured your scope 1 and 2 emissions according to your baseline year, the next step would be to conduct a scope 3 screening to develop your reporting process and include all relevant categories. So like I said before, not all of the 15 categories are going to be relevant to you, so it's important to sit down and figure out what are going to be mandatory for you to report on and what you can exclude. And then lastly, step 4 is to identify the emission hotspots and begin to set targets to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. So you've developed a carbon inventory, you're ready to start making the reductions and setting goals, and you're going to want to base your reductions off of the leading climate science to be aligned with best practice. So I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about what it means to set a science-based target and how you can do that. So targets are considered science-based when they are in line with the level of decarbonization that is required to meet the goals that were established at the Paris Agreement. So that is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial levels and pursue the efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So the Science Based Targets Initiative is a global body that enables businesses to set emission reduction targets in line with the latest climate science. The Science-Based Targets Initiative is a collaboration between the Carbon Disclosure Project, the United Nations Global Impact, the World Resource Institute, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature. The initiative emphasizes the importance of setting these science-based targets as a powerful way of boosting your company's competitive advantage in the transition to a low carbon economy, as stakeholders across the board are prioritizing decarbonization effects in the companies that they're looking to invest in. So for SMEs, this process is actually extremely easy because the SBTI has a streamlined target validation route for you all. This route enables you to bypass the initial step of committing to set the science-based target and the regular validation process. And unlike the larger companies, the near-term targets for the SMEs does not require you to set targets for your Scope 3 emissions. So how do you go about setting these targets with the SBTI? So the first thing you're going to want to do is measure your emissions. If you want to officially submit your targets to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, your emissions data must be in line with the greenhouse gas protocol. So you can see how some of these frameworks can really start to build off of each other. So after you've measured your emissions, the next step is to complete the SBTI SME application, select and set those targets. This is as easy as going onto their website, filling out the company data on the application, and selecting one of the two targets, the first one being a near-term target and the second one being a long-term target towards 2050, which would be net zero. So this step is not necessarily mandatory. If you would like to set targets that are aligned with the science set out by SBTI, you can do that. You do not have to submit the application. However, then you would not get your targets validated by SBTI, but you can utilize the decarbonization pathway to set your own targets. However, for this instance, you've already submitted your application, you've selected and set your targets. The next step, number 3, would to be identifying the reduction measures. So where do you have to reduce? How much do you have to reduce? And in what time are what you're looking for in this goal? So for number 3, when you're identifying your reduction measures, this would be a great place to utilize some sort of low carbon transition tool or some way to model your data in a way that illustrates how much you need to reduce and by when, allowing you to progress towards your goals. So then the last step would be to report on your progress, start measuring and reducing your Scope 3. So like I said before, for SMEs, it is not yet required for Scope 3 to be reported on with SBTI, but it is definitely good practice to start. And you must also report on your progress so you can maintain that transparency with your stakeholders and other partners as well. So now I'm going to pass things off to my colleague Joseph, who's going to talk to you all about the increasing importance of climate risks.
Thanks, Virginia. I appreciate it. So far today, Zach has told us about the importance of creating a robust climate strategy. Virginia's gone into the greenhouse gas protocol and carbon accounting, as well as setting science-based targets with the SBTI. Now we're going to look at what you need to do to understand and address climate risks for your company. When we look at the challenges facing SMEs today, we cannot ignore the threat of climate change. In 2021 alone, there was $343 billion in weather and climate-related economic loss. Climate events such as droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, floods, and sea level rise all have the potential to act as threat multipliers, right? These are going to worsen existing problems for your company and create new ones. You can see on this slide that one climate event, one climate risk can cause so many disruptions throughout our society. So a climate event like a wildfire, right, it's going to directly impact people's livelihoods. It's going to cause issues such as unemployment, interruptions to food and resource availability. It's going to affect people's health and well-being. Right? With this effect on people's livelihoods, we're going to see that that's directly tied to the economy. Right? There's going to be changes in the way finances are run and the way businesses operate. We've seen industry transformation in the reallocation of capital happening already. As these changes compound and more climate risks and events continue to happen, we can expect for these to impact global trade. large-scale industry changes, they'll be impacting the markets. They'll cause supply chain disruptions, shifting trade agreements, trade routes, and all of this can accumulate into social instability, humanitarian crises, conflict over food and other natural resources, as well as the breakdown of government structures. All of these things are so clearly tied to climate events, and we know climate events are going to become more and more frequent as climate change gets worse. The World Economic Forum has predicted that 5 out of the 10 most severe risks in the next decade are going to be environmentally related. This means that these are issues and ideas that we need to start thinking about and planning for right now. I want to take a moment here to highlight the importance of considering your entire organization and value chain in relation to these climate risks. Right, this is critical because climate change, as I mentioned, is a global phenomenon. It's going to affect all companies and pose a serious threat to SMEs. Your company needs to take a holistic approach, consider your entire organization and value chain if you want to effectively address these risks. Climate risks can impact multiple dimensions of your company. Okay, so let's think of an example, a very real example here. Let's say you open a store in South Florida, and due to sea level rise and the frequency of rain down there, your street begins to flood more and more often. Operationally, you're going to have to be closing down every single time it floods. Financially, you're going to have to be paying for flood repairs, your insurance rates are going to go up, right? And so you're taking a lot of hits on your financials as well. Additionally, you're going to need to develop a strategy now. How are you going to mitigate flood damages in your store? And how are you going to be able to open up doors faster after each flood event? If you don't develop that strategy, you're putting your reputation at risk. You might become the company that's known for having their doors closed and just being shut down all the time. Right, you can picture pretty easily how one climate event may impact your operations or your financial or strategic decisions and even your reputation. I also want to highlight that these risks have the potential to affect your entire value chain, from the extraction of raw materials to your direct operations. Let's consider that store down in Florida again. Let's say you get all of your soda products from a large bottling and canning facility that's somewhere else in Florida. And a hurricane comes through, and while the hurricane doesn't affect your store, it takes out that can and bottle facility. All of a sudden, your products are off the shelf. Maybe you're paying a premium to get them. Maybe you're getting them from somewhere else and you're paying extra shipping costs. Right? There's a lot of different things that can happen completely outside of your control. And that kind of shows why it's so important that you look at your entire value chain to be prepared for climate risks and events that aren't even happening to your direct stores or locations. Right? To do this, you're going to need to look at potential impacts in different regions across the world or across the US and how they're going to impact your supply chain or other stakeholders. Let's consider our store down in South Florida one more time. Say there was no hurricane, but there's a drought in Brazil that significantly impacts the sugarcane crop. Most of the sugarcane in the world comes from Brazil. So that means your canning and bottling facility isn't going to be able to produce the soda like it was before. Supply is going to go down and your costs are going to go up. There isn't a cookie cutter solution to problems like these, but you have to ask yourself, do you want to be bleeding money while you scramble and try to find a solution? Or do you want to have a strategy in place so that you can step up while your competitors fall behind? Climate change is a global phenomenon. It's going to affect all companies regardless of your size or industry. These risks pose a serious financial threat, and your company needs to identify, mitigate, and integrate them into your overall risk management, or you're going to end up paying the price. I know that was a bit doom and gloom, but I'm not going to leave you hanging here. Right now, we're going to take a look at a way to manage and understand your climate-related risks. So we're going to look at this framework from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD. These risks, which are becoming more and more important for you, are really highlighted and explained in the TCFD framework. The framework provides best practice guidance on understanding your risks as well as your opportunities. And using this framework, importantly, is going to help you align with that SEC regulation that Virginia was mentioning earlier, and we can expect future regulations to be built on this framework as well. So there's really 4 layers to this framework: governance, strategy, risk management, and then metrics and targets. And the key to these layers is that you want sustainability and climate-related risks to be integrated into each layer of the framework. I also want to note that the TCFD recognizes two different types of climate-related risks: transition risks and physical risks. Transition risks are related to the changes in policy and market condition that we expect to see and that are necessary as we transition to a low-carbon economy. Physical risks are related to the impact of climate change on your company. So that's like sea level rise and extreme weather events. In addition to these risks, they've also identified opportunities related to energy sources, products, and markets. If your company is able to identify and take advantage of these opportunities, you're going to be better positioned to succeed in the changing climate. So overall, the TCFD, it's a great tool for your SME to be able to identify climate risks and opportunities, integrate them into your strategy and risk management programs, and all of that is going to help you fully understand the financial impact of climate change. So the last thing I want to say about climate risks is that there are two different perspectives that you can take while considering them. The first perspective is the impact your business has on climate change. This includes your carbon footprint and taking steps to reduce it through carbon accounting and participating in initiatives such as the SBTI, right? A lot of those things that Virginia was sharing with us earlier. The second perspective is the impact of climate change on your business. This includes understanding potential risks and opportunities and how they could impact your specific operations, your supply chain, and your financial performance. I just mentioned that the TCFD provides a really great way to categorize and understand these risks and opportunities. It's important for your business to take both perspectives into account when you're building your sustainability strategy. By understanding your impact on climate change and the impact of climate change on you, you can make more informed decisions and be better prepared for the future. Okay, so today, we've gone over the importance of the strategy. We've gone over some of the different pieces from carbon accounting with the GHG protocol to setting targets with the SBTI and understanding our risks using the TCFD framework. But now we're going to put that all together and look at disclosing on a climate-related platform. So as the world is taking steps to build a more sustainable future, we all recognize that corporate action is needed. The CDP is a not-for-profit charity that runs a global disclosure system for investors, companies, cities, and states, all to help manage and disclose their environmental impacts. If your SME aligns with the CDP framework, you're going to be compliant with a lot of the things we've been talking about today. This one platform connects all of the pieces that we've touched on, and it's a really, really useful tool for helping you mature your sustainability strategy. At CEMAsys, we've been CDP accredited providers for over a decade. We are experts with this platform, and we know how SMEs can best utilize this framework. So reporting on all of the modules within CDP may be difficult for some SMEs due to the commitment of resources. So to stay in line with CDP, you need to commit to succeeding in these three core modules, right? These being measure, commit, and then action and impact. The measure module states that companies shall provide all scope 1 and 2 emissions, your calculation methodology, relevant exclusions, and describe your company's emissions intensity. The commit module states that companies must disclose the details of their climate-related targets and their progress made towards them. Finally, the action and impact module. It says the company shall state whether they have implemented actions to reduce their operational and value chain emissions and an explanation of the year-over-year changes. As your organization grows, along with your knowledge and your reporting capability, you're going to be able to start reporting on more and more modules within the CDP framework. I want to mention that we have an exceptional track record of aiding our clients in improving their CDP reporting, and we know that it can help companies really create a comprehensive and robust and mature climate strategy. So as we wrap up our discussion on the importance of climate risks and reporting, I want to come back to this graphic that Virginia shared with you earlier. And now that we've gone through the slides today, we can really start connecting all the dots. At the start, down in that analyze section, we see develop a carbon inventory and assess carbon reduction potentials. And this goes hand in hand with the greenhouse gas protocol and carbon accounting that Virginia started telling us about. As we move up into strategize, we see develop a low carbon transition plan and set science-based targets. You're going to be able to do that by following the guidance from the SBTI. Next, we have identify and manage climate-related risks and opportunities. I talked about how the TCFD provides a very good framework for doing just that. And finally, up and operationalize. We have align your climate strategy with your business and your operations, as well as monitor and update progress. It's so important for you guys to track progress against your goals. Regularly reevaluating your progress and impact is going to help you make sure that your initiatives are having the impact you want, not only on your carbon footprint, but also on your business and your operations as a whole. Okay, so I know we've thrown a lot at you today, but before we kind of move into the Q&A, I want to get everybody pointed in the same direction here. When it comes to developing and implementing your ESG strategy, the most important thing that you can do is start. Making changes today has a much greater impact than making changes down the road does. Now, your company may be in the same boat as a lot of other SMEs. Not everybody has the resources available to comply with all of the recommendations from all the different frameworks. In recognition of this, the frameworks have different reporting requirements based on company size. So your company is going to get started, and you might be getting started at the fundamental level, right? This means you're just beginning to report on and gain awareness of your ESG impacts and your risks. This level of maturity is going to cover the most essential elements to adhere to when reporting on your ESG metrics. And I want to say that this is a great spot for you to start. That way you can build and mature your sustainability strategy further. As you mature your strategy, you'll reach the mature level of your reporting, right? You're going to be taking tangible actions to meet requirements set by relevant frameworks for your company. You're also going to maybe track KPIs to gain more valuable insights into your actions. And finally, the best practice level. This is another step up, right? This means you're taking comprehensive steps to align with relevant frameworks and regulations that are representing best practice. I want to add here that CEMAsys has developed a tool to help walk through each of the major frameworks. You'll understand the requirements, and it'll help you get a picture of where your company stands regarding your current ESG maturity level. The tool is also going to help you set your aspirations and determine where you want to be in the future, as well as help you develop a personalized roadmap to go from where you are today to where you plan on being. Throw your email in the chat if you want us to get back to you with this tool. That way we know who wants it, who's interested, and we can have a conversation about how to use it. Or you can email, again, news@SMEs.com. Okay, so key takeaways from today's presentation. Obviously, I just mentioned how important it is to get started, but what do you need to do, right? First thing here, we have measure and calculate your scope 1 and 2 emissions. This is a great starting point for understanding your carbon footprint, and Virginia was telling us about it earlier, so we know what's going on here. The next is to set targets aligned with the best climate science, right? This is using the SBTI that Virginia was telling us about to set meaningful and impactful targets. Next, we want to commit to calculate and reducing our scope 3 emissions. We know these can have a significant impact on our overall carbon footprint. Next, we have identifying your climate risks, right? We want to get those integrated into our overall risk management processes and our strategy. That way we can make the best decisions as we go forward. And finally, I want to say this again, publicly disclose your progress. You need to be transparent about where you are right now and where you want to be in the future. Remember that nobody's going to be perfect when they start, but everybody can start today. All right, so now we're going to jump into the Q&A portion. I can see that we have some questions in the chat already, so we'll start addressing those. Zach and Virginia are going to tune back in here, and we will get right to it.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so I see just off the top here a few or two questions that are kind of similar. The first one being, how does SBTI define an SME? And essentially, it defines an SME as any company with fewer than 500 employees. And I believe that this does not include either financial institutions or oil and gas companies, as a side note there. And then the other question was, what if my company has a changing or fluctuating number of employees year to year? So for companies with a lot of seasonal employees, or where that number is changing throughout the year, the SBTI, I believe, wants you to take an annual average of your employees and use that as your metric for determining whether or not you are an SME.
So I'm seeing a question here too about what are the biggest obstacles that an SME might face when developing their climate strategy. And I would have to say one of the biggest obstacles I believe that they will face is just not having as many resources as those larger companies. So maybe not having the budget for a specialized management system, or not having the time. Maybe you don't have a designated ESG person. So all of these things are obstacles that smaller reporting companies may have to overcome. But like Joe said, even if you don't have a budget, even if you're starting from nothing, it's best to just start. And some free things or things that you can do internally, like changing your internal culture to be more focused on sustainability, communicating with your coworkers and management. It's important to remember that you don't need to take a huge giant step towards your climate strategy first. It's important to just keep putting one foot in front of the other and doing what you can where you can. Good question.
That was a great answer, Virginia. I want to encourage people to keep sending their questions in. We've got a few in the chat here. And I see one asking about the additional CDP modules. I mentioned that you need to align with the 3 core ones initially, and as you kind of develop, you can align and report on more of these modules. The additional modules are energy reporting and value chain emissions, which are very aligned with the greenhouse gas protocol that Virginia told us about today, as well as management and resilience, and then climate solutions. And these are modules that are leading into the more mature and best practice levels. I also want to note that if you go and look up information about CDP reporting, you want to make sure you're looking at the SME climate framework. Again, they do have a special framework for SMEs, which is different from what is required by large corporations. All right, keep sending these questions in, guys. Jess, I want to let you know I see your message asking about shipping clients, and we will connect after this instead of going into that right now with everybody.
I have a question here about how to communicate your climate progress with stakeholders or with any investors or anything like that. And I would say your website is obviously an amazing opportunity to highlight any progress that you've made towards your goals, any major accomplishments. So I would start there. Also, developing a sustainability report. I know oftentimes companies will include a sustainability section in their financial report, which is perfectly fine. But now, as we're seeing shifts in consumers prioritizing brands that take sustainability seriously, I would highly recommend going through and doing a sustainability report. Obviously, this is something that you would do after you've done all of these steps and have your carbon accounting. But even communicating that you've gotten started is big enough in itself. So yeah, sustainability report, your website, monthly newsletters is also another option as well. Thank you for the question.
I think we have addressed most of the questions. I see one more here, just kind of voicing some concern or asking if my company is very small and has limited resources, how will I be able to comply with new regulations? And essentially, we've been talking a lot today about the SEC regulation that's just around the corner. It will impact SMEs, but to a very reasonable extent from what the proposal looks like at this time. And it seems as though the SEC will offer a generous runway for SMEs to be able to take their time and gather resources, gather their information in order to disclose. And then obviously scope 3 emissions would be likely completely excluded for SMEs from this proposal. So I believe that addresses most of the questions we've got here. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to email us at news@CEMAsys.com, and we'll be able to get back to you with any thoughts, concerns that you may have about the material we presented today. But I would just like to thank everyone for coming, and thank you for all participating. We really appreciate it. I also want to note that CEMAsys is offering a 1-hour free ESG guidance session for those of you who are interested. You can also email us at news@CEMAsys.com to schedule that meeting. And yeah, thank you guys again. We really appreciate it, and have a great day.